When I look at your economic statistics, the government debt is growing more rapidly than the economy. And that's where I question the sanity and the health of the US economy. People usually look at the index, but this is a superficial view. I think it's a huge risk. In the world, you have some markets that are topping out and will come down. And then you have some markets like China and Hong Kong and emerging markets that are bottoming out, and from where they will go up. So I have built relatively large positions in Colombia and Chile and Brazil. I was well known for being bearish on Hong Kong real estate. But now, for the first time in my life, I think that Hong Kong property stocks are very interesting.
Dr. Faber, welcome to Global Money Talks. We have a good following of your view, and I think you are known for contrarian view on certain issues, and you are the editor and publisher of the Global Boom and Doom Report. Can you tell us a little bit about this newsletter?
Well, I started to work in 1970 in the United States for a brokerage firm, an investment bank. It was later bought by Merrill Lynch. And then later I worked for Drexel Burnham. But I was always eager to present a view of the world that is not the typical American view. Because as you probably know, in Korea, the Anglo-Saxon view of history and of geopolitics is somewhat different than the view of 88% of the world's population that lives in emerging economies or in economies that are societies that have different cultural background than the United States. So I wanted to present a view that is a bit different than the mainstream economic thinking of the United States, and also about how societies are structured. And so I started to write. At that time, Americans were not used to foreign exchange transactions. And I was interested in the dollar exchange rate because the dollar was perceived to be overvalued in Europe and around the world. So I started to write about that. And then I had some success also with investments in commodities. And then I continued to write. And of course, the brokerage and investment banks in America, they didn't like it so much. But basically, in those days, the compliance department had no power. The power was with the salesman or the investment advisor, because he had the access to the clients. So I developed some following. And then when I started my own business, I then changed the name from just the market comment to this is the Gloom, Boom, and Doom Report. And I write about economics. And my specialty, as you may remember, was always like emerging markets and the economic growth potential of emerging economies, both in Asia and in Latin America. And also we had a Russia fund and so forth. And nowadays, I also write about historical facts, because we're dealing with America that is sort of an empire. That's certainly their view. And there's a rising power in the world that includes countries like China and India and Brazil and Indonesia and Bangladesh and Pakistan and so forth, and the whole Middle Eastern complex. And when you have rising powers in the world and established power, and the rising power have stronger economic growth and become industrial-wise very important, it creates tensions inevitably. That was also in the years 1870 to 1920. Germany by 1910 overtook Britain in terms of industrial production. And then it came to war. War is also, as you probably know, an engine of some people to make a lot of money, because in war, there are war profits, and some people become very wealthy during war times. So anyway, I'm writing about these social issues also because we have a society that is fractured in the sense that the wealthy people in the last 40 years have become incredibly wealthy.
That's true.
But the middle class and the lower classes, and this I've seen also in South Korea, have been struggling because they have a lot of debts. In other words, they borrowed too much money and now it's difficult to repay the debts and so forth. So this is an issue that I'm also concerned with, this wealth inequality and tensions within a country. And then, of course, the main issue is, are stocks going to go up or down? Is gold going to go up? Are bonds going to rally? So every month I have to write 2 reports. And this is, for me, it's a lot of work. Maybe for other people, they can write faster than I can. But for me, it takes time.
So it looks like this letter is a very global, proper global view of the world, and sounds very interesting. I thought you were still based in Hong Kong, but you moved to Thailand in Chiang Mai. So when did you move to Thailand, and what was the reason for relocating from Hong Kong, which is Asia financial center?
Yes, this is a very good question. I was born in Switzerland and I grew up in Switzerland. My parents were divorced, and so I grew up with my mother, and we were initially not wealthy people, and I started to work early and I went to university and all this. But basically all my life, and especially in Hong Kong, I moved to Hong Kong after New York in 1973. 1973, I came to Hong Kong. And by the way, one of the first things I did in those days is invest in South Korea.
Oh, that's right.
It wasn't allowed, but I could open. I had a friend in Korea, a Korean, and he opened an account with Sampo Securities. Sampo Securities.
Yes.
Then it went past Sampo. But I knew the owner, and he was a lively guy. He liked to go drinking and with girls in the nightclubs and so forth. Anyway, that was a very profitable thing to do. But in Hong Kong, the real estate is very expensive. So you live on relatively small space and you work in relatively small offices. But as you can see, I have a very, very large book collection. And
nice.
I have also a communist memorabilia collection of Mao and Stalin and Lenin and all these leaders, Engels, Marx. And then I said to myself, I was traveling a lot. I said to myself, I keep an office in Hong Kong, but during the Asian crisis, and I had bought real estate before in Thailand, but during the Asian crisis, there was some property that became available in the center of the city of Chiang Mai, next to the river. So I said, I want to live next to the river. And so we bought the property and then I enlarged it. And then I said to myself, instead of paying high rents in Hong Kong and so forth, I moved to Thailand because I was traveling a lot in those days, including to South Korea.
Wow, that's a very fascinating story. I lived and worked in Hong Kong twice, so I know the living environment is not the most ideal.
Yes, but it's a nice, I mean, if I were young today, if I were 25 or so, I would still go to Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. I still think it's a great city in the world. You can walk around, nobody attacks you, nobody knocks you down. Nobody talks about this nonsense about diversity and whatever, races and so forth. So I think it's still a great city. and the nightlife is good, maybe not as good as in Seoul. I don't know. I came to Seoul first time in 73 because a friend of mine, he was the owner of a famous Swiss company that sold knitting machines and ship engines. And he introduced me to the two brothers Lee, who were the founder of Samsung Textiles.
Oh, is that
And
right?
this, from there, the whole group came about.
Okay. Interesting story. So the market looks very interesting. You made some great calls in the past. I
And
think
some very bad ones too.
Black Monday 1987, Asia financial crisis 97, global financial crisis 2008. So at this moment, what is the most important thesis that you look at in the financial market? What is the most dominant topic that you are interested in?
Well, I think as an investor, and I have two lives, you have to understand. I'm an economist by background, I have a PhD, and I wrote my thesis about social issues and financial issues. It was about the financial reform of Robert Peel, where he repealed the Corn Laws and the Navigation Acts in England, introduced free trade, and introduced an income tax instead of tariffs. Now, so I'm concerned as an economist, how do you lift the standards of living of the majority of the people higher? We're not talking about a system to lift the wealth of a handful of people, you understand? We want to lift the typical Korean citizens' standards of living to a higher level. That is our objective. Not to favor one group or favor another group. To lift the typical Korean household standards of living higher. So academically, I'm interested in creating a reasonably equal society of not equal opportunities, that people have a chance to improve their lives. And the capitalistic system is the best system in that respect. But secondly, as my profession is, because I was also favored through the asset inflation we had in the world, I'm interested in investments or not investments. So traditionally, what is safe was a deposit in a bank, or say the purchase of a treasury bill. But in inflationary times, in monetary inflationary times, it's you have to protect your wealth differently, because cash usually returns a negative rate of interest because the cost of living are going up more. What people usually call inflation. Now, it's basically an increase in the quantity of money, as you know. And so the prices go up more than the rate of interest you get in the bank. So you have to invest in different asset classes, say in real estate or stocks or bonds, or in collectibles, in paintings, in old Chinese ceramics, or in precious metals, or coffee, cocoa, wheat, soybeans, and so forth. But you have to do something with your money in order to preserve the purchasing power of money. Cash in the bank will not preserve your purchasing power. And so I'm concerned as an investor how to make money. But as an academic, I'm concerned about how to create a society that is reasonably happy. I mean, you know, happiness is a very strange expression, but societies where opportunities are favorable for the majority of people.
I mean, that's a very important topic, and it is true that the real wages, a lot of people in the U.S. and outside the U.S. globally has suffered in the past couple of decades. I'm currently doing an interview from San Francisco, and what I feel about the U.S. economy is, I think, the living standard, the quality of life has deteriorated for a lot of middle income people because of the very high inflation during the COVID and thereafter.
You're 100% right. This is the fact. But not only in the US, also in France, Britain. I mean, you go to some British cities in the north of the island. Mm-hmm. I tell you, it's not a pretty sight. They're impoverished. They have nothing. Mm-hmm. And industries have moved. Mm. But this is always in the world that there are changes that are occurring. I mean, Manchester in 1840, 1820, 1840, 1850 was probably the richest city in the world. Detroit in the 1920s was the richest city in the world. So the change always occurs. And I read in a book in 97 when the takeover of Hong Kong occurred from the sovereignty of Britain to China about the rise and the fall of cities. Is throughout history, cities have become rich and then poor.
So very interesting topic. What is your current assessment of the U.S. economy? I think, there is definitely inflation and people's real incomes have suffered, but I think the growth is still here. I think people are spending a lot of money. The market has been pretty favorable. Mm-hmm. So the wealth effect has come into play. Is there any risk of U.S. because the growth always cannot be sustained forever? So is there any risk of a U.S. recession in your view?
Well, first of all, we have to define what is economic growth. Because let's say we have two economies. I'm economy A and you're economy B. Mm-hmm. My economy grows slowly because we don't borrow money. We don't have any borrowings. But your economy, you borrow money from the world and from internal sources, mostly money printing. The Federal Reserve can print money. So the quantity of money expands. And so you can show some growth. But when I look at your economic statistics, the government debt is growing more rapidly than the economy. Uh-huh. And that's where I question the sanity and the health of the US economy. It's all borrowed money. And that money, until recently, was almost like free of charge because interest rates went down. As you know, they peaked out in 1981. Yeah. 10 years treasuries were yielding more than 15% in those days. Korean banks had to pay very high interest to get the money because nobody trusted them, and also Korean companies. And then interest rates fell until, say, May, June 2020. At that time, the 10 years treasury in America was less than 0.6%, 0.57% was the lowest point. Since then, interest rates have been going up. So what this means is until 2020, the interest payments on the US government debt were going down, although the debt was going up. But now the interest rates on the government debt is growing very rapidly. It's now more than $1 trillion a year. And you have to think what this means in the long run. Mm. The US government has an interest to keep interest rates down because it's such a high expenditure, $1 trillion a year. But the market is smart. The market says, Well, it's inflationary. The prices are going up.
Yeah.
And so the bond market hasn't reacted very well until now. Now, I'm talking about short and long term. Short term, I think bonds in America can rally somewhat. But long term, interest rates move in long cycles. Some people call them Kondratievs.
Yep.
So, but basically, we've been in a down cycle since 1981. And now, since 2020, 22, we're in an up cycle of inflation and interest rates.
Yeah.
Now, the question between you and me and others is, how high will inflation go? I think under American presidents like Trump and Biden, the interest rates will go up a lot.
Okay.
Maybe 20, 30%, but not tomorrow. You understand that these cycles are long cycles. They take 20, 30 years.
So you have a view that the inflation and interest rate both will continue to climb. And is that a big risk for the financial market, for the stock prices?
I think it's a huge risk.
Okay.
Because as you know, and you kind of indicated that in an email, the US market, and that I need to stress, people usually look at the index, the Kospi index or the DAX index in Germany or the FTSE in London or the Dow or the S&P in America. But this is a superficial view. We have to look. The S&P has 500 stocks. In theory, because it's capital weighted, in theory, one stock could go up a lot in a day and 499 could go down and the index would be up. In theory, it doesn't happen usually, but the last 12 months, as you know, the majority of the gain of the S&P has been in maximum 10 stocks.
The breadth has been very narrow,
Magnificent
right?
Seven.
Yes.
There's we call this a very narrow leadership. The generals are moving ahead, but the army is not following. That was the great technical analyst who wrote many books, Joe Granville, was explaining about this. And I've seen this before, in Japan in 88, 89. And I've seen it in the US already in 1970, 1973. We called them at that time the Nifty 50. These were stocks like Xerox, Kodak, Polaroid, Sears, J.C. Penney. Most of them have disappeared, but they were at that time the favorite stocks.
So you think the history will repeat and the current narrow leadership by certain names, whether it's M7 or a couple of big tech stocks, that's something that we need to be very careful about.
Correct. I think the NVIDIAs of this world, the semiconductors, the stocks like Google, Meta, everything, all these companies are highly vulnerable because their valuation is very high.
Yeah.
You understand? You asked me about investments and what I do. I'm interested to buy something that nobody wants.
So that's what we call contrarian view, right?
Yes. By definition, if nobody wants something, it must be cheap by definition.
Definitely. Yeah.
And if as soon as the stupid media in the Western world writes about something, and most journalists are useless, then it becomes popular. The whole world was gambling in Bitcoin and NVIDIA and Tesla, the two most widely held stocks by the public in America are Tesla and NVIDIA. Both are questionable in terms of the quality of earnings sustainability in the long run.
Mm.
Tesla lives from subsidies. And
We got
the
we got
majority shareholder now is in the government. Is a
yeah,
joke.
yeah. We got a lot of Tesla fans in Korea. So Korean retails own 2% of Tesla. So they have done quite
Yes.
well, but we take your concern. Can we talk a little bit about the Trump and his administration? He's a pretty aggressive person. He has been busy since he inaugurated on January 20th. So are you worried about his leadership, and well, what do you think his next 4 years will be?
First of all, I have to say, I would have voted him in 2016 or 2015,
Hmm.
and I would have voted for him now
Hmm.
because I would never have voted for Hillary Clinton and never have voted for Joe Biden and these characters. You
Hmm.
understand?
Yeah,
They are
yeah.
left wing. And,
Hmm.
uh, and then comes the question in America, who controls the government?
Uh-huh.
Who controls the president? People talk about the deep state, and then they talk about the conspiracy theories. But I think there's some very powerful people that control actually who is
Hmm.
running the government. I
That's
mean,
very interesting.
Biden wasn't running the US government, he was sick in his head.
Hmm.
So somebody is behind. And
Hmm.
who? Who organized the COVID?
Hmm.
And so forth? So who made the money from COVID? You
Uh-huh.
have to ask these questions. Otherwise, the people will always do the wrong thing. So anyway, my view is he could be very good for business because he will reduce the regulation
Yep.
and simplify the system of doing business. That is positive. On the negative side, is he is a narcissist who believes in himself and
Hmm.
he thinks he knows everything better than other people.
That's a big risk.
The tariffs, and I've studied extensively about tariffs and import duties and so forth, because it's something that interested me as a student, and I wasn't a very good student. I was more interested in the girls who studied at the university than in economics. But anyway, the tariffs is a form of taxation. It's a very stupid form of taxation because there's so many ways to essentially evade it, and it's very complex. And by the way, I studied taxation, the historical background under a person in Germany who was responsible for the introduction of the value-added tax. The value-added tax is the fairest tax you can imagine. Because
That's an
it's
indirect tax, right? Yeah.
Yes, indirect. But of course, the socialists will say, well, it's an unfair tax because it taxes poor people more heavily than rich people. But then, anyway, you will never find a completely fair world. But because of that, I became interested in taxation and the fiscal policies. Now, some professors, I forgot his name, but he was a Swedish professor. He wrote about taxation. When you start to interfere into the economy with taxation, you need to know exactly what you are doing, because if you impose tax here on this side, maybe that side here will pay for it because you
Uh-huh.
can roll over your tax.
Hmm.
Say I increase taxation, the sales tax of department store sales. At first sight, you will say, well, the department store has to pay the sales tax. But that is not the case. They can increase the price, then the consumer pays the higher tax. So we have to be very, very careful with taxation issues. And number two, for instance, the tariffs on Canada. is the most stupid tariffs I can see, because Canada exports oil to the United States, more than 4 million barrels a day.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, that's right. And also, if Canada doesn't sell electricity to the east coast of the US, they can close down the East Coast economy.
So it could
Canada supplies a large portion of US electricity needs on the east side.
Oh.
So what I want to say, you say, okay, I impose tariffs on China. Well, who exports from China to the US? About 50% of exports are American companies in China who exports to the US. So the tariffs is a horrible idea.
Mm-hmm.
Only someone who's never studied anything would impose tariffs to start a trade war. There are many things the Americans need more than China. Believe me.
Tariff, I think relying on too much tariff carries a lot of risk for the Trump, right?
For the global economy.
Okay, for the global economy. Yeah. I mean, I have a last question, Dr. Faber. I know you have analyzed emerging market for a long time. I think if we look at past 20, 30 years, because the US economy, driven by the tech and narrow sectors, have done very well. So overall, developed market have performed very well against the emerging market. So would there be any turnaround situation, DM versus the emerging market EM?
Yes, I'm very happy that you asked the question. Since 2010, emerging markets have performed relative to the US, to the S&P, the Nasdaq, the Dow, miserably.
Mm-hmm.
The result is that emerging markets today are relative to the US cheaper than they were in 99, 2000, when emerging markets was also very depressed. What happened after 2000 is, after 2003, especially markets like China, India, and so forth, they took off. And they outperformed the US until 2010. And since then, the US has outperformed the emerging markets. I'd say, and this is the issue, that if you ask me about the markets, I would have to answer your question about stock markets the following way. In the world, you have some markets that are topping out and will come down. And then you have some markets like China and Hong Kong, especially Hong Kong properties and emerging markets, that are bottoming out, and from where they will go up. But this process may take some time. Now, I give you an example. Or 2.5 years ago, I wrote about Turkey. I said that Turkish stocks are very cheap because the currency had collapsed and everybody was negative about Erdogan and so forth. I said to buy some Turkish stocks. But even Turkish people said, well, you're crazy. That will never go up. What happened is in 2023, they went up like a rocket. They doubled.
Wow.
And at the end of 23, Milei in Argentina got elected. And I looked at the Argentinian stocks, and they were very, very inexpensive. I mean, I wasn't sure they would go up, but I thought they're very cheap. And so I bought some stocks in Argentina. Last year, Argentina was the best performing emerging market.
Yes, yes.
So now I look at Colombia and other emerging markets in Latin America, because I think, as you know, we had just had Davos, the Davos meeting in Switzerland. Yep. The Davos people are people that are kind of the deep state. They want, they pretend they are for democracy, but therefore for their own power,
Mm-hmm.
nothing else. Millet is a libertarian. In other words, he wants little regulation, little government influence, and so on. And he's done so well. I think a lot of people will wake up in the world and say, well, let's try. I mean, it worked in Argentina. The market is up. Inflation is down. Interest rates are down. The economy is doing better. Let's try it as well. So I have built relatively large positions in Colombia and Chile and Brazil. And then, I mean, maybe you remember, I think you were at CLSA, right?
No, with Merrill Lynch and
Merrill
JP
Lynch.
Morgan.
Anyway, I was well known for being bearish on Hong Kong real estate. But now, for the first time in my life, I think that Hong Kong property stocks are very interesting.
Okay.
Because they sell at a huge discount to the asset value.
Yeah, yeah.
Same like, I think Korean stocks are cheap, but the problem in Korea is corporate governance. And some families, they control. So it's very difficult to unlock value.
No, I think you made a good point that corporate governance in Korea is terrible. We make a little progress, but there's also a lot of influences by the chaebol. So I'm currently chairman of the Korean Corporate Governance Forum, which is the NGO advocating for the better corporate governance. But it's a tough battle to tame and fight against the chaebols.
Yes.
Well,
You're like Hercules cleaning up the stable.
Yeah. So, Dr. Faber, I mean, thank you very much for your time. It has been a very wonderful learning, interesting discussion. And I know it's pretty late in the evening. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Sawadee krap.